I'll send you a link. No, that doesn't work. It was in the invite. The last email that Gene sent. But you don't have that one.
Is there any information that I can provide? I hear some comments about, oh, Gene sent that.
You have it in your email now.
Gene, I think it was a random side thing with a mic on. It was nothing.
Okay. Well, I want to thank people for coming. I give people a couple of minutes to get settled, then we can get started. All right. So please let me know if you can't hear me. I will let you know if I need you to speak up. So welcome to this session to discuss using GitHub or some technology for doing collaborative authoring or diffs or issue tracking during AUTH48. I've set up the agenda so people could provide comments and suggestions for topics to talk about. So let me move through the slides here. I've included the note well because this is a side meeting of the IETF. This talks about how we participate in these sessions. Okay, you should have seen this already. All right, so the agenda, covered the note well. I'd like to do some agenda bashing. So the overview of the topics that we wanted to go over, a brief description of our editing process, previous experiments that the RPC has run, and then the ideas that were put on the agenda. So we've got, oh, I see somebody's joined the queue. Martin?
Yeah, Gene, I think it might be worth talking a little bit also about what the requirements might be here.
Yes.
So maybe what it is that authors might appreciate having from the process.
Yes, that is the what benefits and features are we seeking, is both authors and editors. And then talking about the technology. We've said GitHub. Do we really need GitHub? Talking about where the source files live, who's controlling them. Can the processes that we are discussing be offered to all authors during AUTH48? And then more into the details, what would pull requests and diffs look like? So my own agenda bash is that we skip going over the previous experiments. That would save us a little bit of time and give us more time to talk. Are people okay with that, or would they like to get an overview of what we've done in the past?
Maybe just move it to the end, and if we have time.
Okay. All right. So just briefly, just want to say that we are talking about AUTH48 and the use of GitHub for the edit state and the RFC editor state. We're not going to cover the edit state. We do all sorts of stuff. We start with, could be just text files or V2 or V3, and we make changes to those. We move them to V3, and through multiple passes, we make various edits, everything from adjusting commas to asking questions about passage clarity. Then, the RFC editor state, that's a pass by another editor. And when we are done with the documents, we present them during AUTH48. So we have our XML file with the questions in them, and diff files that we present, so you can see the changes that we've made. So what we're focusing on is how authors would want to use GitHub in perhaps an experiment for AUTH48. We've done this a few times already. So here are the previous experiments. And if you follow the link, there's a lot more information. And it also includes the feedback from the authors and the editors when we got it. One of the documents, the authors did not respond to the survey. But if we have time, we can come back to these slides. All right. So the next slides are just capturing at a high level what people put on the agenda page. And I've organized them from the broadest topics, and then they get more specific as we go on. So the first topic is, when we say GitHub, what benefits and features do we want from this? So are we talking tracking content changes, the distributed authoring, issue tracking, pull requests, audit trails? What do we want? Mike, I see you're in the queue.
Mike Bishop. I think the answer here is kind of yes. And we do want the audit trail of what changes were made. We want to be able, when there's a BIS document, to be able to pull in, like, start from where we were, already have it ready to go. When we worked on the quick documents, a big part of it was that changes were sent out to the working group of, if you're interested, this is what's happening. So there was transparency, which I know there's work on making the AUTH48 be its own list and have that be visible to anybody who wants to read. But I feel like AUTH48 is kind of a black box right now, where the working group finishes a document and then the RFC is published. And some changes happened in the meantime, and the rest of the working group didn't see those. So I think above all, to me, it's the transparency and it's the having the edit trail.
Martin?
Yeah, so I'm going to slightly disagree, maybe add to what Mike just said. The thing that I've been looking for from this process is really the ability to review the changes as they come in. That's basically it. And that has been rather difficult because they tend to arrive all as one giant blob, an undifferentiated mass where you have XML changes, you have minor grammar and so forth editing, so commas and which and that and all those sorts of other things piled in there, as well as some of the more substantive stuff where there's a sentence that's unclear and there's an edit being made to improve the clarity, plus all of the issues that are raised in the process. So to give an example, when we did Quick, we essentially had to go through the entire document looking for each one of these things as we went down. So the first thing that we did was looked at the text output, because you can get a nice clean diff, and you look for the textual changes and you go through all of that. And then you sort out the differences there and you merge in all of those changes that are good. And then you have an XML document that you can compare to the other one and look at the XML changes and so on and so forth. And it requires a lot of iterations. So for me, this is not about the AUTH48 process as much as it is the editing process, because having the editing process be transparent to the authors of the document means that it's much easier to see the changes that are coming through at the end. And we might use issue tracking and pull requests and all those sorts of other things, but that's just a consequence of trying to make it transparent.
Julian?
Hi there. So, first of all, I agree with what was just said. We've been through AUTH48 for the HTTP docs last month. And so some of them were marked up in Cramdown, some in native XML. The main issue that I see, and I'm just rephrasing what Martin essentially said, for our specs, we actually want to have a track record about what changed when and why, and have that complete. So when we started on the revision of the HTTP specs, we could actually start from a source code repository that had the whole history of the specs since 15 years ago, something like that. And now in the edit and AUTH48 phase, unless we backport every single change, we lose that information. And backporting these changes means that we have to look at each change and see whether it's just typo fix, an editorial improvement, some bigger change that came up during AUTH48, which requires a working group discussion potentially. So as Martin said, most of that apparently is during edit, not during AUTH48. So I think that's really what we need to look at. And I don't think we should look at the actual technology for that right now, maybe at the end, but we should try to understand why people, how much transparency we need. I mean, if it's in some kind of public repository, that's good. Whether it's GitHub or something else is a different discussion, but it's very important to understand why people want this.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I would largely agree with what Martin said. It's like critically important to be able to distinguish every single change that's been made and figure out why it's been made, and not have to wade through like a bunch of changes which are fundamentally don't change the text but only change formatting, and look at the changes that make formatting and have those separated out. The other thing that's important is to actually allow the authors and the ADs and the RPC to collaborate during the final phase of this, as the final read through happens and you notice changes, and they have to be tracked and they have to be managed through the process. And having those in emails is like very, very difficult. And finally, being able to understand what the state of the document is at any given time is also critical. To get a repository like Git always has the current state in main, but for instance, having a situation where You download the XML file from the site, but it's the same URL every time. And so when you download it later, it's changed, and you can't like track those changes is difficult. So having basically checkpoints that are having every change be accounted for and every change and knowing why every change happened is like the main thing.
Thank you. Michael?
My view is, I don't want to contradict anyone else. Actually, I agree with them very much. But specifically, the thing that I see is that we get inconsistent amount of engagement from authors. They don't know what's going on or whether they're reviewing the current state. And I think that's what Eckert's kind of getting at, that you need the latest thing and they need to be looking at what's going on. And so to a certain extent, I think that it's actually issue tracking and the ability to have an author say quite easily, yes, I agree with this. Yes, I agree with this. This is the part I have a problem with. And I think that particularly with the big long diffs and the emails, some of us are really good at going through them and some authors are really not. They really need to be spoon-fed the individual changes to think about. And I think actually we can probably cut our AUTH48 time significantly this way, by doing this. So.
You. Mike Bishop.
Yeah, so back up again. Nothing has been said that I disagree with. I think to expand on a couple of those, Julian mentioned in passing one thing that I think makes this a little more complicated, which is that not all of us author in XML. And so, I was working in Markdown, I got the XML diff and the text diff back, and then I retconned all of those into my Markdown file so that it would produce that XML file. And in the process, imposed GitHub on my AUTH48, even though the RPC wasn't. And that took a while. But the other thing I wanted to highlight, Ecker was mentioning AD reviews. I did find it very helpful during AUTH48 for HTTP3 when the email went to the ADs of, here are substantive changes that were made in AUTH48, ADs, do you approve it? And then I was immediately able to follow up with, and here's the issue discussion, here's the PR where those happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I got an email from the ADs saying, thank you, that made it very easy to review.
Jillian, I see that you're still in the queue. Did you have another comment? Oh, okay. And then Ecker, did you want to follow up on someone else's comments?
No, I just didn't get out of the queue.
Okay. All right, Robert.
So I wanted to point to some corners in some of the statements that Julian and Mike have made and ask for thinking about the implications. Julian in particular talked about the working group having the history going back years for a document and wanting to maintain that. And there is an implied requirement, I think, that the process make it easy for you to feed things back into the same technology that the working group had been using all of that time. I at least heard strong complaints about having to go in and copy things back into the format that the working group had been using. And as we're working our way through this problem, think about what would happen if, for instance, one of the things that Jay's been poking at, if we actually explicitly created a different authoring grammar and publication grammar, whether, what impact that would have on attempting to have the working group use the tooling that they were used to using during the document development during the AUTH48 process versus moving into potentially a different technology that was tracking changes during that period.
Thank you. Rich?
Yeah, I just want to, a couple of people have touched on it, but just to make it really explicit, about a third of all drafts submitted in the past year were written in some form of Markdown. And I understand that you want to work, the RPC needs to work with the publication format, but it's difficult. Mike has talked anecdotal about how he had to go back and forth. I had the same thing with my little 10-page draft. Maybe there's ways to tie the blah to XML stuff so it adds comments back to the original line numbers or something like that, so that when you make comments, I don't expect that the RPC can support all input formats, but clearly, you know, 1/3 are now in one of two, basically more than a quarter of them are in cram down format. And better support for that one way or another is, I think, going to be an increasingly big requirement. Thanks.
Karsten.
Unmuting is really slow on this platform.
Yes.
Sorry, I should have done that before. I'm really trying to focus here on the authoring process as a whole. And AUTH48 is an important period in that authoring process. It's preceded by working group work, author work, and so on. It's followed by working group work and author work in many, many cases because there are BIS documents. And of course, in that BIS work, as other people have said, it's really useful to be able to see who did what, why. So right now we get the finished XML files, the non-prepped ones, those that are still in the authoring version of RFC XML and not the publication version. And we run those through an upconverter and get back Markdown. But that, of course, has a lot of formatting done different. That has become better with the RPC no longer reformatting things, I have heard. I haven't actually been part of a process where that was important yet. But what I really would like to focus on is the authoring process is a long process. AUTH48 is a period somewhere in that process. And the better it actually integrates with the other parts before and after that, the easier it is to create quality documents.
I did want to follow up on your comment that the RPC is not formatting. In what way? Because we do actually, our formatting steps are at the very beginning. We get a document, could be a V2, could be text, could be V3, but our formatting pass is at the beginning. And that's when we're looking at lists and tables and artwork and source code and getting it all up to a certain level of V3.
I was talking about the XML formatting. So do you insert line breaks in the XML source that are of no consequence in the actual output?
We try not to, yes.
Yeah. So that's
yes.
a significant improvement already.
All right. Thank you. Paul Hoffman.
So I think from the previous comments and especially from, you know, what Carson just said, we call it AUTH48. It's obviously not AUTH48 anymore, but we still are treating it as a monolithic step. A draft goes into the RFC editor. It is not seen again until it is edited and formatted and whatever. And then there is a list of, there's the question, is this good? Given that we're talking about tools, and tools don't have to be a single step, a different proposal would be that, in fact, we get rid of the concept of AUTH48. We keep the concept of final sign-off. But in fact, if something comes in as a text file or as Markdown, that the RPC first does an editing pass, not a formatting pass. They do the, and that comes out, at least in my experience in AUTH48, ignoring formatting, editing comes out in approximately 2 buckets, editorial and questions. Editorial, I actually look through because I'm sort of picky on that's and whiches. Sorry about that. I'm not as bad as some of your other authors who will disagree with you on those, but I do check on those. If in fact the process is an editorial process followed by a formatting process, and then of course the authors have to do a second sign off, and the editorial process is done on the input format, it would make it would get you better answers to, is this right? How does this look? Those won't get lost as easily. And it also means, quite frankly, I think for the formatting pass, everyone's just going to go, yeah, right, whatever. Like that they actually don't care about that. Like the worst thing you could do is make their lists wrong. And, that I would suspect is extremely rare. So I know this means sort of radically rethinking how it's done, and it includes another set of interactions, but the outcome will be that the authors understand things more. And so I'm going to get to my second point because it's related. A problem that I've had on documents is that AUTH48 currently gets sent out as a message, and then somebody is expected to say yes or no. When there's multiple authors, sometimes the authors disagree. And I don't remember what it was, but sometime in the last 2 years, I was in a situation where, because I'm fast, I said yes to things and one of my co-authors said no. And I don't know how that might have messed you all up. You might have started taking Paul's yeses and, going ahead and then had to backtrack. But the email from that got messy very quickly. And basically my co-author just gave up because I had jumped in too quickly. I think if things are done in, where the editorial pass requires all authors to have signed off on the final bit of the editorial, you're going to get the fast folks like Paul who go in and say yes, no, and or mostly yes. And if the other authors want, that's fine. But this goes back to especially what Martin was asking for, was tracking in the process. Because just because I said yes, and now the text looks like this, doesn't mean that that's what my co-author wants. And in particular, doesn't mean what my AD wants. And then again, just do the formatting at the end. I know the formatting's not trivial, but for us authors, the outcome of the formatting is trivial. We're just going to say yes unless you got a bulleted list to be a numbered list or something like that, by and large, on that stuff. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And just to comment on how we process author answers, yes, we assume that the author speaking is already checked with their co-authors, and we go forward with the feedback we receive. If an author comes back later and says they...
Gene, that's basically never true, I believe. I mean, even in documents that I'm not co-author on that I've watched, I believe that is basically never true.
And the email is a discussion. The email, the email thread is the discussion.
Yes. Julian?
Actually, sometimes this is even not true for a single author, because like me in past AUTH48, I had forgotten that I had agreed to something weeks before. I wanted to say something about what you just said earlier about format conversion, which is very important for you and for the whole process. But I think most of the people sitting here are already submitting these 3 documents, either because they edit them or because Cramdown generates them for them. So that might explain why lots of the feedback that you get isn't concerned about that step. That's just an explanation, because those people submitting plain text or V2 documents probably are not here in this meeting. And the other thing I wanted to comment on was Robert, who I think asked whether I actually wanted the edits of the RPC to be done in my source control system, in my native repository. And of course, the answer to this is, in a perfect world, yes, if that would be possible. But we have a large spectrum between what the authors use for editing and tracking and what we currently use, emails and AUTH48 and diffs. And we don't need to go from 0% to 100%. It would be good if we can at least find a way that, as others said, clearly editorial stuff is clearly separated from other changes. So they can be looked and tracked in groups instead of a monolithic thing.
Thank you. Ecker.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually getting you to say much of what Paul said. Operationally, like I find the two biggest challenges in this process are one, backporting all the material to Markdown, because like I want to prepare a BIS, I want to have the Markdown look like the produce roughly the same text as previously the case, so I don't have to redo it again, and that's like an enormous challenge. And then finding, and as I say, disentangling all the different changes. In a traditional document preparation process, you would have a proofreading, have a copy editing phase, which is done entirely on the source text, with no typesetting at all. And then you'd have a proofreading phase, which is done on the typeset manuscript, on the galley proofs. And so we don't have that. We have one phase, and like really we need to separate those in order to like actually have things work out properly. I understand there's a certain reluctance to work in like multiple source code formats. My sense is that we could tolerate more than one, but probably not infinite. I think my put would be like, obviously XML v3, anything else which has like a really large user base, which I think Cram Down is at this point. And then, if we're gonna do a copy edit phase and people insist on using something that was not one of those things, the copy edit can happen simply by marking up the actual text files as opposed to marking up the source format, and then people can backport them into their own stuff and you can proofread it out. But I think like I guess one thing I would say is that like in a traditional document preparation format, the author is responsible for making the copy edit changes. The copy editor is responsible for making the copy edits and telling the authors about them. And we've inverted that process, which puts like a lot of burden on the authors to like dope out what the changes were. And tools can make that easier, but like, that's part of the source of the problem here.
Robert.
Yeah, I'm going to risk going slightly out of scope. I'll keep it short. I'd like to ask people to think about a future that looks quite a bit different than the one that we are currently talking about making small changes to, and making a big change to the way that we process our documents. And I'm going to speak in terms of implementation just to get through this quickly. Consider something like a state during IESG processing before IESG approval, where the ISG was otherwise about to send something to the RFC editor queue, but then sent a period where the RFC editor and the working group iterated on substantive changes and finished the iteration on substantive changes without working on output format at all, just working on the content of the text before the ISG actually hit the approval button. And then the number of changes that people would be reviewing in AUTH48 really would be more publication kinds of changes rather than clarity kind of changes.
Mike.
So I think that really boils down to the same suggestion that Paul made, that you do the copy editing first. And going back to my recent experience with H3 and before that with Quick, we made the changes in Markdown. We produced a new output XML and sent that back to the RFC editor. And then you had to do all your formatting over again. And I'm very sorry about that. But effectively, it means that the formatting happened at the end anyway, like Paul is suggesting. And you also discovered something that was in the document that I didn't even realize the Markdown could not produce. And you fixed it for me, and it's still not right in the repo because I can't get the Markdown to do that.
Sounds like something, an issue to open up on Markdown.
Yeah,
Jay? Okay, cool.
So, sorry if I don't make that much sense. I'm currently COVID isolating, but hopefully I'll get this right. I think it's important to remember that the RPC is a professional publishing function. That's a well-established thing that we have. And that means that at some point, change control of the document will move from the authors to the professional publishing function. And we've decided that that's AUTH48. And that means then that at that point, as well as them having change control, it's their processes that they do, that they think fit best with them for them to be able to manage it. So on that basis, I think we need to separate out two separate things here. The first is the requirement for being able to track and categorize and understand the individual changes made by the RPC. I think that's a straightforward requirement, but we need to remember how the editors work. As Jean explained, they work as human beings. They don't go through and do, right, I'll do one pass for this, then one pass for that, then one pass for that, then one pass for that. They go through the document, and whatever stands out for the document is what they tackle. So if we want to fix that, I think rather than expecting the RPC to change their processes, we need to look at the technology to understand how we can use the technology to do that. Now, that change tracking is actually quite separate from the other thing that a number of people have raised here, which is tying those changes back to the original source format and authoring process. That is actually a significantly harder problem. I understand the BIS issue, but I'm not convinced that trying to fix that for every ID up front is necessarily the best way forward. And again, I think that we should perhaps consider some technical solutions for dealing with this particular issue. If, for example, we had perfect bidirectional translation between Markdown and XML, then that would resolve a lot of things. So I'd just like us to try to separate those things out a little bit and see if we can, apply some technical skills in order to fix these things.
Thank you. Colin.
So I wanted to, it's actually oddly, this sort of speaks to some of Jay's points here. I mean, I often hear sort of arguments of like, well, there's this professional group that does things a certain way. It does, and it is a very professional group, right? But because it is a group that we contract with, and it is a professional group that does that full times. I mean, we teach most new authors to use XML or Markdown or one of those things in a matter of a couple of hours. GitHub is another couple hours. Like, I definitely think that we should take as part of the solution space for this. We should not obviously the RFC editor could learn how to do documents in any one of these things in a completely trivial amount of time compared to the overall time we pay them for every year. So I do think that we need to figure out a tool path and tool chain that works on this. I agree very much with the separation of the two ideas that people talk about here, of one of being understanding the changes and why they were made, and a different one of the backporting type issues. But it doesn't really seem that difficult to solve both of those, and not in every way possible, but for some limited subset of the major tools that we use. And look, the whole point of using Markdown, it is grossly simpler than XML. So there will never be bidirectional between the two. The whole point of Markdown was not to have as much accessibility, not have all the features the XML had. right? So we can't look for a technical solution to map between those two, because the design constraint of the Markdown, what makes it good to use is that it doesn't have, that you can't do that. So we have to stay out of trying to come up with some, pixie magic to do this. We should just look at the normal ways that everyone's working on the tools we have today and what's an efficient way to use them. And it's pretty obvious what those answers are, yet we don't seem to use them. We use them in the working group, yet we don't seem to use them between this process. We have these two sort of isolated, the working group does it this way, editor does it this way. Maybe both of those are fine, but when they're trying to work together, which they are in this late stage, we have to find a way to do that. And I totally reject the idea that the RCI, there's a black box and can't change the way it works. I mean, obviously it can't. So thank you.
Thank you. Paul.
So a couple things on other things people have said. I think Ecker was being too conservative when he said, we can only work on like one or two, that the RPC could only work on one or two formats. Given that it's all text, then I would say, in fact, any editor, at least in my experience with working with, not only with the RPC, but with a whole bunch of different book publishers and stuff, can handle pretty much any kind of text format. So it could be XML v2, v3, Markdown, or, because I know you guys still get plain old text. It's not trivial to jump between those mentally, but it's also not difficult if the first pass is the editorial and, the editorial pass, which again, I've seen over the years. I thought the RPC has done an excellent job of editing when it's editing and putting questions when it's not simple editing. I mean, that's been very, very clear. Oftentimes, if I was going to be critical, I would say, oh, that's a silly question. That's just an editorial question. Go ahead and do it. But that's fine. I mean, I'm not saying undo that. So I disagree with Jay about, a person goes through and we can't expect them to go through multiple times. We don't need to expect them to go through multiple times. The output currently, and certainly before we started on the XML, was just fine for, I know it's editorial if it's just, if I'm seeing a change bar, and I know it's a question because they call it out as a question. I think that works, very, very well. I am intrigued by Robert's proposal. It has one big advantage that we haven't talked about here, which is a non-trivial number of drafts before they become RFCs, but after they've passed the IETF review, get significant technical changes that the IETF doesn't get to review, where in some cases the AD gets to review it, but the ISG does not. And quite frankly, sometimes this has a pretty negative effect, certainly on the morale in the IETF when people go, well, wait a sec. You guys reversed something that we had already talked about in the working group. Oh, it was done in AUTH48. So I like Robert's idea of possibly doing some of this and having the ISG sign off on something that is probably going to then mostly be formatted only. I suspect it won't work. I suspect that there will be too much clogging factor, and it's going to make the ISG's life much harder. But I wouldn't mind seeing the experiment done, because I do think that for the rare cases where it happens, where you get technical changes, it's pretty important. An alternative, to at least to fix that problem, is that everything that the RPC calls out as a question should be reviewed by the AD. And in a perfect world, should be reviewed by the working group if it's a working group document, or by the IAB if it's an IAB stream document. I don't think everyone needs to look at the grammar, but since you guys meaning the RPC, sorry to misgender all of you, I think the RPC is already pulling out questions quite well, and anybody in the working group who cares could look through those and look at the results. I mean, that's the nice thing we have now, is that if there's a series of questions and the authors have come up with an answer, you can look at the version before they came up with the answer and the version after and say, yep, that did not change anything technically.
Just to interrupt really quick, time check, so I was
Sandy,
hoping we could
yes.
cut the queue.
I was just going to mention that we've got 15 minutes, and I also wanted to cut the queue. So, Julian?
Okay, I'll try to be quick and try not to misread what Robert said earlier this time. I think if we have the case where a document has more than trivial changes between what was sent to the ISG and what was sent to the RFC editor, we absolutely should just require a new internet draft to be published, because that's the way the IETF works. And then people can just look at the diffs of the internet drafts, and that's how it's supposed to work. And if we have changes that are critical, just saying the AD approved it and it's probably okay is just not good enough. I know that ADs are trying to avoid that, but I think if we had a hard rule that if it's more than an editorial change, we absolutely need a new draft, that would be simplify these things a lot. The other thing I wanted to mention is that many of us have quite complex tool chains in the meantime. For instance, for the HTTP specs, we have a tool chain that actually extracts the ABNF, checks the ABNF, reformats the ABNF, inserts them as appendix. We have auto-generation of index tables and so on. And that's obviously very hard. If the production center wanted to use that tool chain, that obviously would be very hard, and we can't ask them to do that. So here's a thought experiment. If, let's say, a working group had the tool chain implemented in a way that it's a GitHub action, and that you submit a PR against the source document and then can see what comes out of that. Would it be, I mean, for the editing step, a potential experiment to just say, we'll send a PR with the editorial changes and to your source repository and see what happens, instead of doing that on the converted XML file in the edit phase that the authors can see?
So, Julian, you're proposing the next experiment is, I guess, working in Markdown or XML. And then we do a pull request with all of our changes, like submitting our AUTH48 XML file as the pull request, or are you thinking that we make the edits in multiple? Sorry, I need some more details on the experiment you're proposing.
Yeah, so I think if we look at the pure copy editing phase, so my assumption is, and correct me if I'm wrong, somebody in your group starts reading the document and either takes notes or starts to correct typos and editorial problems right away. And that may take 1 or 2 days or more with a complex document. And then this change sits in your edited document until AUTH48 when the authors get to see it, right?
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Couple of different editors work on the document, and we are working in one document, and then it is released in AUTH48.
And my proposal would be to actually, where technically possible, and I'm not saying it needs to be crammed down or XML because it's an experiment, where it's possible, I mean, we could run this experiment with a small document first, to actually, instead of editing it in place in your office, to actually submit one or several pull requests to the original, well, Git repository, and let the authors merge that, and then let them produce a new document from where you can then start the AUTH48 phase. Something like that.
Okay. Ecker.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a couple points Jade made. I mean, so like as much of what Colin said, I agree with. This is like professional function, but you know, it's not like traditional book publishing where, you know, if I do something with Addison Wesley, I must have to take their process or leave it. We're like the primary customer for the service, and so that means like that, you know, within the bounds of reason, we should have a certain amount of control over how it's executed. In particular, like, you know, as I said, traditional publishing does have a multi-pass structure, so I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for multi-pass structure here. Also, in terms of change control, the situation is really quite nuanced, right? It's sometimes the case that the publisher takes final control, but I produce documents, a book, in fact, where I produce camera-ready copy. I produce PDF, and they printed out the PDF like, you know, directly on their offset printers. And so they never had change control anything, and they sent me marked up paper. I'm not suggesting we do that here, but I mean, the fact that these are mechanical tools, that we're using the same rough tools to generate the output as in the final publication stage as we do ordinarily, like means this is a much more complicated, nuanced situation than traditional book publishing, where maybe they're you know, maybe you're writing in Word and they're printing in frame. And so like I heard earlier the suggestion that like there should be a different set of tool changes to produce the final documents than we used it at ours. That would like be a huge regression. The fact that we already have this goofy situation where authors are writing one version of SMLU3 and it gets prepped out in some other version and published is like already a problem. We should try to revert that, not move forward.
Thanks. So we're down to 9 minutes. Rich, really, really quickly.
Yeah, very quickly, I just want to add a gloss to Paul's comments, which is the area director is probably the wrong person to overload with feedback. The working group chair is less loaded and more incented to get documents out and more focused on what the working group content is, and is probably in a better position to say, oh, this is a technical change that would affect that we should take a step back and re-review. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And Julian, sorry, we had cut the queue. So to very briefly, I'll skip to the end of the slides. So we focused more on benefits and features, and we're discussing at a very high level what the issues people had in AUTH48 and what they would like to see different. So we did not touch on whether we should be using Git or GitHub or GitLab or Google Docs even. We have not talked about, well, we did talk a little bit about should, you know, the editor participate in the author's repo. Julian had recommended that as an experiment. We did not get to the, can we do this for everybody? And this was down in the details. Like if we were talking about GitHub, although I guess we did talk a bit about what these, the diffs should look like, and people were wanting to see perhaps multiple passes from the RPC on their documents. All right, so we're to the wrap up. So skimmed over what we did not talk about. And so what I was hearing from a, let me go through my notes and summarize. People were, although I said it was not in scope, people were talking about the edit and RFC pass, RFC editor pass on the documents. We discussed we talked about a lot of stuff, and I'm trying to figure out what some of our next experiments might be. Julian did say, let's see if we can play in an author's repo. Does anyone have other suggestions for a small experiment with some of the things discussed? I see Ecker and Paul are in the queue. Ecker?
Just incompetence.
Oh, all right. Paul?
I know it was my idea, so I feel weird about suggesting it, but it seemed like my idea resonated of doing an editorial pass first of some sort. I'm seeing there's a bunch of thumbs up here. Since you don't have your camera on, but yeah, there's a lot of thumbs. That's a reasonable experiment, even if it doesn't go all the way to where you went with the GitHub experiment, of doing that and then seeing how that affects your process. You know, it may turn out that really sucks for your process, and that would be good to know. But if it doesn't suck, I think that would actually be a really good first step to other things that you could then do later and show it to the authors this way, or include these people or whatever. But just to see if flipping that over actually works for you.
All right, thank you. Cullen.
So I think what I'm proposing is doing more of what I think you've already done, but I'm very confused about what has been done. So the idea of forking a source repo or forming a new GitHub, forking the source repo to have a repo that is under control of the RFC editor, and doing the changes in the source format, be that XML or Markdown, and working with collaboratively using the GitHub series of tools to do that. I believe you've done that for both Markdown and XML at this point. I'm sort of worrying about do more of that, and +1 the editorial path separation for sure. I mean, is there a problem? And I mean, was there an outcome in that experiment that suggested we shouldn't be doing that, or something I'm missing here?
No, not necessarily. And so we can do that. We can iterate on the most recent experiment, which was 9245, if I've got the RFC number right.
Right. Well, I'm just sort of saying, expand that and start using that to a broader set of people. I mean, can we have an outcome of that experiment? If it was a success, thumbs up, combine it with the editorial separation and move forward and try some more of it, I guess.
All right. Thank you. Ecker?
Sorry, I just lost the window. I'll try to find it again.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for offering your ideas and suggestions. I've really appreciated your time. We've got a lot of notes, and we'll be writing that up. We'll update the hedge doc, and I'll send out some info to the RFC interest list. Any other questions, comments?
Thanks for asking, seriously.
Right.
Thank you for your time.
All righty.